It's my honor. There we go. So it's my honor to introduce Harlan Pruden, Nehiyaw First Nations Cree, who works with and for the Two-Spirit community locally, nationally, and internationally. Currently, Harlan is an educator at Chimamuk, an Indigenous public health program at BC Centre for Disease Control, and is also the co-founder of the Two-Spirit Dry Lab, North America's first research group lab that exclusively focuses on Two-Spirit people, communities, and/or experiences. Harlan is also the managing editor of twospiritjournal.com and an advisory member of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research's Institute of Gender and Health. Before relocating to Vancouver in 2015, Harlan was the co-founder and director of New York City community-based organization, the Northeast Two-Spirit Society, and was a President Obama appointee for the U.S. Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS, and provided advice, information, and recommendations to the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the White House. And there's a note that in December 2018, Harlan was happily fired / dismissed from the council by Mr. Trump via FedEx. So with that, I will just give everyone the housekeeping rules to feel free to use the Q&A if you want to ask questions that we can address afterwards, or after the talk, if you want to use the raise your hand function, we can unmute you that way. With that, take it away.
Thank you. Tante, natutimtik Harlan Pruden, e waka no mani niha ayakwe. Greetings, my relatives. My government name is Harlan Pruden, and my Indian name is waka no mani, which is it's actually in Sioux. It's 3 words, waka no mani. I was doing some work on the Rosebud Reservation, and they honored me with that name, waka no mani. Waka being spirit, good spirit, bad spirit, neutral spirit. Like I can do good just as well as I can do bad, or I can like suck up a lot of space and do absolutely nothing, right? So that part of my name is a responsibility of how do I want to show up. And so my intent is always to show up with a good heart, with good words and good thoughts. That's my intent. And sometimes I fail or I miss the mark, but those are only mistakes when I don't learn about them. But if I learn and reflect and grow from those missteps, then there are learning opportunities. So again, waka being spirit, how do I want to show up? Nom is to, and mani is a sacred journey. So I was going to get that translated into Cree. I'm First Nations Cree. My mother's from the Beaver Lake Indian Reserve. My father is from the Saddle Lake Indian Reserve. 2 different reservations, but the same Cree nation, which I humbly say is the best nation in the whole wide world. And I also said that I am Two-Spirit within my own language. Niha, I am a Yahweh. And so it does my heart so good that we have this time and the space and place to talk about what and who Two-Spirit people are. I'd like to thank you all for attending. I know you have a mark or a grade. In my mind, I will think you're here because you want to be here and that you have a choice to be here. So thank you so much. I'd also like to thank Ross and Christina and Ellie and Marianne for hosting and organizing so that we may have this opportunity together. So I just want to contextualize a little bit about the talk in that, yes, this talk is going to be interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. We are talking about people, and people don't come in pretty little faculties like the School of Economics or the School of Anthropology. We're talking about people, and thereby we have to take a kind of an interdisciplinary or a broader lens. So this talk will we will be discussing history, anthropology, gender and human sexuality, sociology, political science, language, law, maybe some constitutional law, religious as well as Native studies. It's going to be all over the board. And then finally, we're only going to be a survey. So we're just tipping our toe into a very, very large lake or body of knowledge. And so it is my hope that 1, I will leave you with many questions, and I will also maybe adding to your knowledge, or 2, you probably know some of these areas better than I do. And so this is a co-creation process. But if there is questions or the yearning of information that you're left after the talk, one, I think we should engage in a conversation around that. But I invite you to walk with me to find the answers to your questions as we work to restore the Two-Spirit peoples' honor, respect, and dignity that we once had. And so I would invite you to join us on our healing journey. So before I go any further, I wish to acknowledge that I am on the ancestral, unceded, and traditional territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation is where I'm broadcasting from today. Now, this land acknowledgement is not some sort of perfunctory statement that I like, I just rattle off and then I turn to the real business or the real discussion at hand. This is core to this entire talk and also to my, the way in which that I carry myself. Although I am from the best nation in the whole wide world, and I humbly believe that, my ways, my protocols come second to the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations and who are hosting me, and I am on their territory and I'm on their land. If I didn't do this land acknowledgement, I kind of liken it to me walking into your home and one not acknowledging that I'm in your home. And if we carry that analogy forward, I would start telling you how and when to live in your own home or when to clean your house. It's not what I want to do. I want to position myself as a guest, and a part of that guest, and to also honor my hosts, is I've approached all 3 protocol offices for Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh, and I asked if I can be a guest and if they will tolerate my presence and existence in and on their home. And they have all granted me that. So I say that I am a guest, but I've gone through that protocol. I'm not an uninvited guest. Like, how are you a guest that's not invited? That's just a silly term. Anyway, we'll be talking a little bit about that. And then finally is part of this land acknowledgement is to me to also place myself as an ambassador for my people. So if I don't carry myself in a good way and an honorable way, that I run the risk of my hosts thinking nasty things of Harlan, but I then run the risk that they will make some discernments and judgments of my Cree people. And so I show up as an ambassador, and our people show up before we ever show up in the room. And so it is through that ambassadorship that I want to make sure that I am putting and carrying my Cree people first. And they are through me that people make discernments around my Cree people. So I think that we all have ambassadorships, and your people show up in rooms before you show up. And so I think that is also part of this land acknowledgement. And I just want to unpack that and own that of what do I really mean when I invoke that land acknowledgement. I encourage you all, if you all are going to do a land acknowledgement, is say it, but then unpack it. What do you really mean with that acknowledgement? And so it doesn't just become a perfunctory statement. Own it. All right. Oh no. Give me 1 sec. I did an updated presentation, and that next slide just told me that I don't have the most up-to-date. All right. Hey, who saw me present, and where did you see me present? Use the chat function.
I got nobody responding to you, Harlan. We're still here.
Okay, I am so sorry.
No, it's no problem at all.
All right, so silly me, I did not save my last update, so I'm just going to go with what I had another thing planned. Okay, Oh, well.
No problem.
So what we're going to be talking about is just very brief. We're going to like unpack some of these concepts around gender identity, gender role, and sex and sexual orientation. And we need these so that we can have a better conversation around what and who Two-Spirit person is. How many folks have seen the gender-bred person before? So there are some kind of cool and not cool at the same time. So this genderbred person is the first iteration. There's genderbred 2.0, 2, 2.0, 3, 4. Now there's the gender unicorn, and now they just came up with the gender galaxy. But if we go back to the primary document, it informs all of the subsequent conversations, and it's not, there is some, you see baked into the actual architecture is some fundamental problems that we're going to be talking about when it comes to Two-Spirit people. So first of all, gender identity. Gender identity is an internal conversation. How do I view myself? Either as a, and here is a binary, it's either a woman, and then the opposite binary and a man, and if there is like somewhere in the between is this gender queer, this concept of gender queer. Gender expression is how do I express that gender? And so a part of that expression, like right now I'm wearing earrings, you know, and I'm standing like this, but I can also stand like this, right? And walk like this, right? So it's how do we express that gender? And there is from this like scale from the feminine to masculine, and then like a blending of two is what we call androgynous. Biological sex is a physical description, and it is also biological or chromosomal. And so we have the scale here from female or male. And for my language, because I want to make a distinction between woman and female, is I add a little qualifier of like female assigned and male assigned when we're talking about body and chromosomes, a physical description. And why I use the word and add on assigned, because if something can be assigned, it can be reassigned. And I'm doing a little bit of creating a space for my trans brothers and sisters who may want to embrace biomedical interventions to assist with them in walking their truth. So it is your physical description. Now, if you have a combination of both primary and secondary sex characteristics, we would call that intersex. You may know that concept as hermaphrodite, but again, that's a derogatory term. We no longer use it. We use the term intersex. Now, sexual orientation is a little bit of an outlier. Sexual orientation is an internal conversation. I find someone attractive. But if we don't know the assignment, i.e. the sex of who we find attractive, there's no way that we can make sense of sexual orientation. So I, as a male assigned individual, find another male assigned individual. We would say that that's homosexual. Again, we don't use that word. We say gay. I, as a male assigned individual, find a female assigned individual attractive. We call that heterosexual or straight. And then if I find them both attractive, we would say that that is bisexual. Now, why I start with this is probably within your Western framework in your education, is that these are how these terms are operationally defined. And we're comfortable with these, and these shouldn't be coming out of left field because it is baked into our educational system. Now, why I start here is if we were trying to plot out Two-Spirit on this within genderbred and that's framework, we would find it incredibly difficult. There's no attentiveness to other genders, history, role, purpose, and so it's a highly problematic system when it comes to discussing Two-Spirit. I found this little genderbred person. It's like a little Inuk, you can see by the parka, right? But it's the exact same framework, and it's still a binary: gender identity, womanness, manness, gender expression, feminine, masculine. Biological sex is femaleness or maleness, and then they bifurcated sexual orientation into attraction, romantic, and sexual. But it's still firmly rooted in a binary, and I would still have a hard time of plotting Two-Spirit within this framework. So I would like to now talk a little bit about the 529 years of colonization. This is a painting that was commissioned by the Met by this incredible two-spirit artist, Kent Monkman. I would encourage folks, if you haven't seen Kent's work, to dig into it. It is beautiful and so thought-provoking. And this is called Welcome to the Newcomers, and it was hanging up in the Great Hall in the Met. It actually just came down this year. It was up for about a year. Too bad it was during the pandemic. When I was in New York in the summer, I wish that I could have gone seen the full exhibit. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some historical context around colonization. In that, and this revisiting of our past, but this is just but one example. So in 1928, sterilization begins here within Canada. The Alberta legislature passes the Sexual Sterilization Act and begins the sterilization of residential students that prevented them from giving birth and to continuing our culture. That legislation was only repealed in 1972. That is in my lifetime. Probably not in your lifetime, but I know within Jamie's lifetime, Ross's lifetime, it was in his lifetime also. I'm making some assumptions. And it's really interesting to note that in the 70s, that's when the women's rights and the rise of feminism was happening, yet there was no attentiveness to this. The only other province that passed the the Sterilization Act was here within British Columbia in 1933. Sterilization begins in British Columbia, and that act was not repealed until 1973, again within my lifetime. Now, I say that this is a really kind of a yucky part of our history. And I often thought that the sterilization only impacted our female assigned individuals. I was looking at some archival records at the University of Lethbridge, and it was from the Sexual Sterilization Board, a panel of 3, not one Native person was on that board. It was also rooted and grounded within our eugenics at that time, that discussion and theory. And I saw like tables in which that the names were redacted and they were just left with ID numbers. And it would say ID name blank, ID number, and then the procedure. And there was like tubal ligation, and then there was vasectomy. And so they were also sterilizing our male assigned individuals. And it was a wholesale sterilization. Similar sort of process happened in the United States. Now I just want to fast forward up into all of our lifetime. How many folks have ever heard of PrEP? PrEP is an HIV intervention that if you're taking it daily and you're exposed to HIV, be it like the condom breaks, or you have sex and you choose to have sex without a condom, or you're sharing a drug injection equipment with someone who's HIV positive. If you're taking this once a day pill and you're exposed to HIV, it's basically voided from your system. Now, walk with me a little bit down into the weeds of health policy. So for First Nations and Inuit people, we receive our healthcare benefits through this program called the Non-Insured Health Benefits Program. And we have a formulary, and it's a 387-page document that lists all of our various prescriptions that are available to us. In December 2009, Truvada, the brand name of HIV PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, was listed. But you had to be HIV positive. It was a limited benefit. But in December 2013, Truvada becomes an open benefit, meaning you don't have to show or justify need or access to that. So literally beginning in December 2013, First Nations people and Inuit people had access to Truvada to use as a PrEP intervention. But then in February 2016, Health Canada approves Truvada to be used as an HIV PrEP intervention. So it would have been on label then. And then, so the very day that it was approved, it was a viable intervention that was on label for HIV PrEP. August 2017, the generic becomes available through our non-insured health benefits. And then it wasn't until January 1st, 2018, that PrEP became available here within BC and the BC Health Insurance or the MSP or BC Care Card or BC Services Card. And then everyone jumped to life and they started saying, yay, we have done this and now we have access. But literally, First Nations people had access to Truvada dating back to December 2013. Did anyone tell us? No. Did anyone say you are the first people to have publicly available and funded PrEP? No. And so I think this is another site of colonization within this PrEP implementation, and that Native people were not included at these various advocacy tables when they were discussing PrEP access. So here are two noble professions, the healthcare industry and the educational industry, that do position themselves as being noble. But these were two handmaidens of colonization, both in the sterilization, medical, and schools. They went to schools. And now a contemporary example of how that history is still playing out today. All right, let's talk about Two-Spirit people. So this is the closest that you're going to get to a definition of what and who Two-Spirit people is. It is a framework and not a definition, and we'll unpack why we cannot offer one definition of what and who Two-Spirit people are. First of all, Two-Spirit is not an identity. It's not an endpoint. Two-Spirit is an organizing tool or strategy. It is a way to identify those individuals who are Indigenous and lay somewhere on the gender spectrum and or the sexual orientation spectrum. And so what I'm saying there is that that you cannot arrive and say that you're Two-Spirit and then that's where the work is. There's another step that has to be a part of that. And like in my introduction, I said that I am a Yahweh. A Yahweh within my Cree people is the identity. That is an endpoint that you can arrive to. Two-Spirit is a way for us to organize, but then the work is, what does it mean within a nation specific, in your nation specific understanding, if you had that tradition. The term Two-Spirit doesn't make sense unless it's contextualized within an Indigenous framework or community. Two-Spirit within a traditional setting was a gender analysis as opposed to a sexual orientation analysis, meaning that some nations had two genders, while others had three. Some had 4, 5, 6, 7 different genders. Unbeknownst, like genderbread only has those 2 gender identity points, the binary and a little bit of like the blending in the 2. How do we make sense of a world that has 7 different genders? We'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. Today, most people associate the term with LGBTQI native or plus native or Indigenous people. However, the work of Two-Spirit organizations, leaders, elders, and community members is more akin to this traditional understanding of who were we within a pre-contact setting. And what is the application and the relevancy of those ways and of being within a contemporary setting? Now, a little bit of etymology of where did Two-Spirit come from. So those nations, up until contact, those nations that had a Two-Spirit tradition, we had our own words within our own languages that named and accounted and to identify our Two-Spirit relatives, these other genders. Now, I put 1492 because 1492 was a big day for us, a big year for us. That is like in October-ish in 1492. CC shows up on the shores of what we would call Hispaniola, right? Puts on a stake and goes, I have discovered you, right? We all know that narrative. Where I'd like to counter that narrative of like, in 1492, the Indigenous people of Hispaniola, they woke up and they discovered CC on their shores. So there's incredibly important teachings of what is our framework? What point or vantage point are we looking from? What is our truth? And are there competing truths or equal truths? So I share that with you, just a little snippet into the truth. Now, a little after 1492 to around 1989, 1990, the term berdache was used. Now, berdache is this French word. There was these French missionaries that were wandering around Turtle Island, and they saw these individuals that were like maybe male assigned and hanging out and doing the work of women, or female assigned hanging out and doing the work of men. And they were like, this doesn't fit into my rigid binary gender system where there's only men and women, just like the good book said, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, right? So like, what do we call them? What do we call them? So there was this Persian word barja that was spread throughout Europe. It first showed up in Italian, bardasso, then it showed up in Spanish, bardaxa. And then the early 16th century, about 1525, 1545, I should really know that date. I'll get to it later. The French missionaries translated barja into French, berdache. But if we go back to the Persian word and we look at the translation, it literally translates into a young man or boy who serves as another succubus. Y'all have to Google that word because it's a crazy A word. Succubus, S-U-C-C-U-B-U-S, permitting sodomy to be committed upon him or a passive homosexual partner. Let's keep this real. And I say this to my elders also. I don't reserve this for like non-native audiences. What are we talking about? So on man hot sex, and we hope it's hot, right? Because it's just a waste of time when it's not, right? There is a passive bottom, and when the bottom's not passive, we call those power bottoms for lazy tops, right? What they were narrowly talking about is what we would say in medical terms is the anal male receptor partner, i.e. the bottom, not the tops, the bottoms. And so that term was used for many, many years, but starting in 1975 with the founding of the Gay American Indians in San Francisco by Randy Burns, Barbara Cameron, and many other community leaders, there was this consciousness that began to take foot. And it culminated at the 1990 Two-Spirit gathering that happened in Manitoba, just outside of Winnipeg, where a grand talking circle was called by all of the attendees. And the attendees said, we hate this word berdache. One, it's base, it's all about sex, and it's about a particular role within sex. It is about he and him, it's not honoring of our Two-Spirit sisters. And it's, for a whole host of reasons, they dismissed that. But then they were like, well, how do we organize within a transnational or a multinational space? Because they're all from different nations. And so after many, many rounds and much discussions, they came up with the term Two-Spirit. They wanted a term that reflected a combination of both masculinity and femininity, which attributed to males in feminine roles and females in masculine roles. And there we get a pivot. The pivot was around your role within society and not sex or what type of sex you're having, sexual orientation. It is about your role within society, and it's that hearkening back to this gender analysis as opposed to a sexual orientation analysis. It is also incredibly important to note that it was a political statement. It was an expression of self-determination, of sovereignty of body and sovereignty of land. The community was like saying, you French missionaries, you members of the academy, both within history, anthropology, and other disciplines, you have no right to name us. That right belongs to us, and we choose Two-Spirit. Now, I've seen papers up until 1996 that still uses the term berdache. If you see berdache in any sort of literature, the framework or the message and the teachings and the knowledge may hold true. The word berdache is highly offensive and we do not use it. I encourage you to take a pen, not even a pencil, take a pen, cross it out and write Two-Spirit. Not two-spirited, we're not a verb. Not two-spiritness, we're not an adjective. Just Two-Spirit, we're a noun. And so that's where a part of that too is. What I'm going to do is just to dwell a little bit on so we can understand this gender analysis. And so I'm not going to go through this entire list. It is a survey and they're all nation specific. I'm only going to talk about the Cree one and a little bit about the Sioux one. So for us Crees is that we have two big dominant camps. We have the men's camp that hunt roughly. We have the women's camp who gather. Also, the way that we've worked as Cree people is that a woman was never allowed in a man's camp and a man was never allowed in a woman's camp. And so if there was ever imbalance or disharmony amongst these two camps, a woman couldn't walk over to the man's camp and say, hey man, what's going on? And a man couldn't walk over to a woman's camp, right? But us as a Yaqui, we were often schooled in both of the languages, both of the work, but we had unfettered and equal access to both of these two camps. And so if there was ever discord or imbalance amongst these two camps, we as a Yaqui, we could go over to the men's camp and we're like, hey man, what's going on, what's happening? Float over to the women's camp, we're like, hey women, what's the skinny, what's going on? And literally we could go back and forth and mediate conflict resolution and balance and harmony amongst these two camps. A man couldn't do this, a woman couldn't do this, just us as a Yaqui can do this. That was our role. And it was a role that was just a different role. Our men hunted, our women gathered, we mediated. And so it was just a different function that no other gender could perform. It was only for us, and it was our unique role and our unique gift and our medicine that we had to offer our people. Now, if I were Sioux, there wouldn't necessarily be a social expectation to be this mediator, but there would be a social expectation that I'd be the officiant of naming ceremonies. And so my good friend Del First has resurrected, and he's Winkday, and that's what you say Two-Spirit in their language. And he does these naming ceremonies now for his Two-Spirit, sorry, his Lakota, sorry, his Sioux brothers and sisters. Now, the takeaway from this is there's no one way of being Two-Spirit. Two-Spirit is going to mean something different if you're Cree, Sioux, or Anishinaabe, if you're Navajo or Dene, or Arapaho, or Cherokee, or Nuchalnath, or Coast Salish. So that's why you cannot offer a definition of what Two-Spirit is, because Two-Spirit is going to mean something different depending on what nation we're a member of. Now, I've collected about 130 terms within our own languages. It's building off of the work that was done by Randy Burns and the Gay American Indians in the Bay Area. And it was also after the scholarship of Willie Roscoe. And I'm constantly adding to this database. I try to do a triple validation process. So when I find a term or a word, I try to find two other primary language speakers to validate the word as well as the translation. There are errors, omissions, and flat out incorrect information within this database. And you're like, Harlan, why are you getting out misinformation? Potentially misinformation. The Seneca ones, the bolded ones, are ones that I'm working on right now. And that one's just the translation is in process. The Guasala ones, these were just gifted to me about 18 months ago from some communities that I'm working with in northern BC. If I were to take the time to sit up in the academy and to comb through this, go through a multi-validation process, it may take a lifetime, heck, it may take 2 lifetimes. And in that intervening lifetime, more of these teachings and knowledge and words may be lost. And so what I'm doing is sharing those 130 terms roughly with people as a beginning of a conversation and a conversation starter. And so if you didn't see your nation there, I encourage you to see if you can find out the word, if you have that word or this tradition within your nation. And if you see your nation there, I encourage you to validate that and to begin that process of that inquiry of, is that the correct word? Is that a good translation? Or is there a better translation? Now, these words are so incredibly important. Where there's a word, there's a story. Where there's a story, there's a people. And they are like medicine. So how we use these words is and operationalize Two-Spirit. So we're like, hey, Two-Spirit, we're doing a powwow, right? If someone answers that calls and they are male assigned and they're Zuni, we gift them their word, if they don't already know it, of Lahamana. And then a framework like this talk to house and to contextualize and to make sense of Lahamana. And then where the beauty and the magic happens is that these individuals start saying, what does Lahamana mean? Who is Lahamana? And what is my role and purpose as a Lahamana for my Zuni people? And calls them back home. In absence of these words and this framework, often our Indigenous LGBT relatives either think that they have to make a choice between being an Indian and being LGBT or queer, and they often run and go into an urban setting, or worse, that they're beaten and shunned and run out of their community as a result of homophobia or transphobia, and then they take refuge within an urban setting, only to come to one of our meetings, our gatherings, and they're gifted this word and a framework to be in that, and it calls them back home. And it is affirming of who they are, of their Indigenous and their indigeneity, as well as their sexual orientation and or their gender identity. And that is the medicine of these words, as well as this work. Now, we're not alone. If you look at other Indigenous communities across the world, they have a similar sort of gender diversity and framework, although they wouldn't use the term Two-Spirit. Two-Spirit is only here for Turtle Island. If I were to take Two-Spirit and refer to all these folks outside of Turtle Island as Two-Spirit, that would be an act of colonization. I don't want to do that. We still need to have that conversation on an international level of how do we want to organize and organize within a global setting. So you look at the Hijra in Pakistan and the Bulbul in Pakistan, or the Mahu in Hawaii, or the Fa'afafine in Samoa, and this list is by no means complete, but it is also fits very comfortable into this framework of gender diversity and a non-binary concept for our Indigenous brothers and sisters that are across and smattered across this globe. All right, let's talk about sex real quickly, okay? So this is a painting by George Catlin. It was painted sometime between 1861 and 1869. The overall size of it is about 1.5 foot by about 2 feet, about 24 inches. And George Catlin was this painter dude, self-taught and of European descent. And he is one of the earliest documentations of our Two-Spirit relatives. Why I always, this shows up in every one of my talks, is because in his journal article number 52, his diary, is as he's working out the composition of this painting, he's doing sketches of it, he writes in his journal that he hopes that this Two-Spirit tradition, well, this tradition, he wouldn't call it Two-Spirit, he hopes that this tradition is, open quote, is extinguished before it is more fully recorded. And this is not like him being tongue-in-cheek. He really wants this like sickiness gone, right? So just as the irony of the very thing that he wants, this tradition to be extinguished before it is more fully recorded, here's the record. So like, thank you, George, for recording it and being one of the earliest recordings of our Two-Spirit people. So this is a painting it's called The Dance to the Berdache. Again, it was painted in 1861. The real name of this, and it's a painting of the Saki or the Sauk and Fox people. I've also seen it if you Google Dance of the Two-Spirit, Dance to the Winkte. But the real name of this painting should be The Dance to the Ikukuwa, I-C-O-O-C-O-O-A. And that's how you would say Two-Spirit and Saki. Now, what is going on in this painting? So this painting is, I have to provide a little bit more political context or political structure. So for the Saki people, they had two chiefs. They had a camp chief, head of government and internal affairs, and they had a war chief, head of state and external relations. And it didn't matter how much a war chief said, we have to go to war, and they would orate and they would justify why they had to go to war. It wasn't until their head Ikukuwa, their head Two-Spirit person, and that's the image, the woman, the individual that's wearing the dress, the buckskin dress, the fourth from the right. The Ikukuwa would say, it'd give the authorization to go to war. So war could not be called unless they got that sign off from that office. So it tells me there was an immense amount of political power that was housed in that Ikukuwa office, that a war chief couldn't unanimously declare war. They had to get the authorization or the declaration from that individual. Then the cool thing, I think it's cool, is on the eve of the battle, the Ikukuwa would walk out in the middle of the encampment, and all of the warriors would come and do an elaborate dance, so that they may position themselves or to be able to catch the eye of the Ikukuwa so they could have sex with the Ikukuwa, this male assigned individual, and so that they could take a little bit of that Ikukuwa spirit or luck or gift to battle the next day. I'm like, what? What? Like, this is one tradition I want to bring back today, right? Like, I remember when I was living in New York, we were at 4 different wars, and I'm like, where the heck is my dance, right? Now, this is the awkwardness around the whole Two-Spirit tradition and this whole Two-Spirit conversation. Because if you harken back to genderbread, there was like the gay, straight, binary, homosexual, heterosexual, and bisexuality in the middle. How can we make sense of the content of this picture within that binary? Are all these warriors who are vying for the sexual attention of another male assigned individual, does that make them gay? Does that make them straight or heteroflexible? Does that make them bi? Are they all bi? Or do we have to opt into a new way of thinking around sexuality that challenges Western notions of sexual orientation and sexuality, a new old way? And so a part of my musings and scholarship is trying to figure out the content of this painting of how do we conceive of sexuality that accounts for this, the subject matter of this painting. I encourage you to join me within that. So in the effort of time, I'm just going to really buzz through this. I'm only going to do another 2 more slides, and then I'm going to like end. For the painting is how do we make sense of that, the content, the subject matter of that painting. So this is a medicine wheel, and it is showing the 4 different genders for us Cree people. We have the Napweo that sits in the north, our men. We have our Squea, our women that sit in the south. And our female assigned individuals sit in the east, and our male assigned individuals sit in the north. Because we have this 4-point gender system, it's also a 4-point logic system, is what I've seen from the archive is that there was a social taboo to have sexual relations or couplings within your gender. So you could not have 2 men hooking up and having sex within your gender, nor could you have 2 women. And so what held true for those genders held true for these genders. I, as a male assigned individual, couldn't hook up with another male assigned Two-Spirit person. I would take a straight man as my husband. And because we're having sex outside of our genders, we would be considered straight. Now, I'm providing a translational space because we actually don't have a word for straight, and we don't have a word for gay. So it's just, we have a word for our Two-Spirit people. And so I think the social convention is that you just had to have sex outside of your gender. And that's the takeaway from that. And that's why I call it heterosexual normative, but heterosexual normativity within a 4-point gender system. Now, we all know, and we should know about the Kinsey report, this sexologist who in 1948 released the seminal report. There's big problems with this study. Things like the only people he studied were white European men. There were no people of color. He would have sex with his participants. So Kinsey, irrespective, the framework still holds true today. The science has changed. All right, so that's the big takeaway. So what Kinsey was really looking at was, irrespective of identity, how the individual identified, what Kinsey was really looking at was, who are the folks, who are these male assigned individuals, who are they attractive to, or who are they actually having sex with? And what Kinsey showed was that 10% of the general population was exclusively heterosexual in behavior. And Kinsey also showed in 1948 that only 10% of the general population was exclusively homosexual in behavior. Now those numbers, because of his sampling size and his methodology, is that those numbers have never been recreated. The highest I've seen is about 5.6 or 6%. That's current data. And I've also seen studies where it's like less than 1% of the general population is exclusively heterosexual in behavior, and only less than 1% is exclusively homosexual in behavior. So I use the coding of approximately around maybe 3.5% of the general population is exclusively heterosexual in behavior, and around 3.5% is exclusively homosexual in behavior. So what does this have to do with the painting? So this is current research. Now, if you take 3.5% plus 3.5%, that equals 7%, leaving us what? 93% of us today have a much more muddy, nuanced, gray sexual behavior. We can't say sexual identity because we actually don't have words to account for that's 93%ers. And so that's what this has to do with the painting, is if we remove the stigma from sex, sex becomes no different from drinking coffee or drinking water, going to an anthropology lecture. It's like nothing, right? Then those warriors, 93% of them would have no problem vying for the sexual attention of another male-assigned individual because it would be a part of themselves. And I think that our elders and our old ones knew that we didn't come in black and white, straight, gay, black, white, heaven, earth, you know, spiritual, non-spiritual, binary, black and white worlds, that we live in a much more shades of gray and nuanced and muddied. And so the story that I tell myself is that the warriors who like laid on the spectrum around like 1 or 2, like they'd be like dancing like this, right? Where the warriors on like 3, 4, 5, they'd be like jumping up and down, like, hey, right? Pick me. So I just share that with you. I also share with you as scholars, as leaders, and our next leaders, I encourage you of like, let's break the binary and let's find the words and identities that honor these 93%. And I know that Jane Ward, in her book, Not Gay, a study of same-sex sexual relations in straight identified white men, comes up with this term heteroflexible, which I'm like, it's still in the binary, right? Like, why isn't, and it's also way like favoring a certain hetero. Like, why isn't homoflexible? Or why isn't it just flexible, right? I know within, there is like, it may have fallen out of vogue, but there was like blow bros, was like on US campuses, where straight guys, if they were having problems having sex, they get together and they have oral sex, but there's this whole dance. Like, you can't look at each other in the eyes while you're having oral sex. And they're just called blow bros or friends with benefits. And so there's stuff that's going on. I think the challenge is that we must do a little work and lean in and try to find different terms that don't affirm the binary, and so that we are pigeonholing ourselves within the binary, and we're doing violences to ourselves if we lop off parts of our sexuality to affirm the binary. And so I just share that with you. This is sex circular, and this is a term that I'm trying to figure out and to define. And my elder, Sharon Day, who's Anishinaabe, when she was looking at that painting, she was like, you know, well, how I would define this. And she just threw out the term and she was like, you can quote me on this. And so I'm trying to like now do the writings and the theoretical understanding of it is, you know, like for Anishinaabe, and we're relatives of Anishinaabe as Cree people, is that a vast, vast majority of us have sexual desires, wants, and needs. We can't say all because they're asexual people, and those desires and wants and needs are going to be context dependent, and they're going to be temporal, meaning they're going to change. They're not fixed on some scale. And so, you know, and so she says it's sex circular, right? So, you know, one day you could be dancing your heart out for a male assigned individual, to the next day you could be positioning yourself and being attractive to a female assigned individual. How I make sense of this is like, you know, when you go to the gym and you see like some incredible like Adonis like curling and it's all like rippling with muscles, and I'm like, wow, that's amazing and beautiful, right? So the next day I could be in a yoga class and I see a graceful, beautiful female assigned individual doing an amazing pose, right? And I'm like, wow, that is so beautiful, right? So it's context dependent. And I think you know what I'm talking about, in that when you see someone walking their truth or their beauty, independent of their assignment, you're going to feel an attraction to them. So that is context dependent. Or temporal, meaning it's going to change from minute by minute or second by second or day by day, or it may take a change over a lifetime. And so there is this fluidity of who do we find attractive, what's the level of that attraction, and it's also going to be tied to this context of, like, it'll be context dependent. And so in this case is that we would say that sex circularity, that we all have sex circularity. And I would add this, if I could go back and revisit genderbread. If you remember that sexual orientation was an internal conversation, but we had to know the assignment, we had to have that piece of data to make sense of sexual orientation, where sex circularity becomes like an internal conversation, that we're just sex circular, that we're attractive to someone. And we don't need to know the assignment of who we find attractive. It would be no different from our gender identity, our gender expression, or our biological sex. It's an internal, or it's us. It's left to us. And so it's just, I'm, again, just musing and trying to figure that painting and the subject matter painting. Who were Two-Spirit people long ago? There's only 20 known historical images. This is about 67% of the images. This is me when I was 5. I add myself into the archive. Colonization, it's a painting that hangs in the Spanish National Gallery that is recounting the journeys of Vasquez Núñez de Balboa, a Spanish conquistador who 1513 was roaming the land that we would call Panama, and found a bunch of guys engaged in same-sex homosexual relations. So what did he do? He rounded them up and had a big old party. No. He rounded them all up and fed them to their dogs. Yeah, but that also is not the truth. He rounded up the berdashes, the bottoms, and fed the bottoms to the dogs. Now in this painting is pure propaganda. You have the brightly colored celebratory Spanish conquistadors, the colonizers. And you have the dark, hedonistic, carnal, evil, sodomistic berdashes. Now the teaching that I have here as anthropologists is, what lens do we bring to this, and what set of assumptions are we bringing to this painting? Are we allying ourselves with the brightly colored celebratory conquistadors? Or as a Two-Spirit person, do I see myself at the bottom of that picture? We give meaning to the painting. The painting doesn't give meaning to us. What is our framework and our analysis when we look at the subject matter of this painting? Are there other points of framework? Are there other analysis and other truths? Are there other meanings of looking at this painting? We bring meaning to the painting. The painting does not bring meaning to us. So it is with that I would like to, what the heck did I just do? I am going to, if you want to go and to get more of this lecture, please go to the twospiritjournal.com, type in resources, and there's this lecture it's a lot longer and it goes into a lot more detail. In summary, Two-Spirit is an intersection, is the intersection of those who embody diverse sexualities, gender roles, gender expressions, and who are Indigenous to Turtle Island. It is a community organizing tool or not, and not an identity. It is going to mean something different depending on what nation an individual is from or a member of. Two-Spirit refers to a history or tradition that predates Western notions or concepts of LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, and intersex, and the list can go on. It is about reclaiming and restoring our rightful place of honor, respect, and dignity, as well as equality that we once had prior to colonization within our respective nations. This work is deep decolonizing work and centers one's ingenuity and calls Two-Spirit people home and is thereby of the mending of our sacred hoop. References, I'll send you a copy of this later. Before I used to be able to say my granny said this, now here are the actual citations. How we say a formal thank you in Cree is Kinonaskumtininawawa. Informally, we would just say hi hi. And the closest expression that we have to a goodbye is examaga. Unlike the finality of the severing of ties in English that connotes with goodbye, that in Cree, examaga means until then, but a closer translation is now that our paths have crossed, they will cross again either in this life or in some other life. It is with the greatest humility and honor that I say, Kinonaskumtininawawa, hi hi, examaga, and I look forward to the next time our paths cross, either in this life or in some other life.
Thank you so much, Harlan. I am going to moderate some Q&A here. And I think how we'll do this, if you want to submit a written question, that's great. There should be a Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen. Or if you want to just type it in the chat, I will get to it. But I would encourage everyone, I think we're very happy to chat live rather than have the formality of me reading your written questions if you're comfortable chatting. So if you do want to chat, can you just raise your hand and I'll monitor that and I'll let you chat. And Harlan, if you're uncomfortable with any of these questions, if you find them offensive, then let me know. I'm more than happy to cut people off, but you know, starting from a point of naivete, I think it'd be great if we could have a bit of conversation.
Can I just add to that is, one, I'm a leader. And as a result of me being a leader is that I put myself into places where other people have not gone before. So nothing you can say is triggering. Nothing you can say is offensive or that will do me any harm. But with that this is an opportunity. I have an open book. Ask any question you want. This is a place of inquiry. This is a place of learning. And don't go, I don't know if I'm saying this correct. Just say it. Create that space. And even if there is something negative or offensive, I'll gently correct, but because it's coming from a place of inquiry and a place of curiosity, let's go to the conversation. So I share with you a real quick story. I was doing some work on a reservation and there was a cookum, a grandmother who wanted to weigh into the conversation. So she put up her hand. I called on her and she just drops the F-bomb, right? She goes, you know, my brother who was a fag, and she went in and I was going to pounce on her as a good activist, right? And I was like, hold up. I have to check some assumptions. I was like, can you tell me a little bit about your brother? And she was like, oh, I love my brother. He's the best beater. He's an amazing cook. And I was like, oh, we don't use the F word. Maybe we use gay or we use two-spirit or we use wink day. And she's like, she was only using the word that she knew and it was not ill-intended. Let's create that space of use whatever word you want and no offense will be taken. Let's have a frank and honest and beautiful conversation. So I open myself up to whatever you want to talk about.
I think that George was happy to go live with us here, so I'm going to try that and we'll see how this works. He submitted a couple of questions. I can read them if he has to go, but there you go, George. I think you are now able to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Harlan, excellent presentation. I really appreciated what you covered in such a short time. I've got, basically two questions, both relating to teaching as it happens. Some years ago, I used to teach a course on sex, gender, and culture. And one thing I emphasized in that course was that gender is culturally constructed. And to illustrate that, I used Walter Williams' book, The Spirit and the Flesh, Sexual Diversity in Native American Cultures.
I think it's gender diversity.
In the early 1990s. But I'm interested in your take on Williams' work. I mean, he's a white queer anthropologist, but I thought his his work was very well researched, but also very sensitive and culturally aware.
Sure. So, as with everything, or what's your second question, George? So I can get
Well, the second has to do with so-called queer archaeology, which is a body of theory and practice that emerged in archaeology about 25 years ago and challenges, notions of heteronormativity in the archaeological record. And it's something that we need to be looking at and looking for, yet is very, very difficult because we're looking at, biological skeletal information, but with material culture that may be of typical male with a biological female skeleton. And so there are some challenges there that I wanted to touch on briefly, but whichever approach you want to take, I'm good with.
Sure. So Walter Williams, first of all, I will have to say that that book, Spirit in the Flesh, was a total game changer in my life and sent me on this inquiry and sent me on my own healing journey. So it was a pivotal text for me. Now, God, how do I I'm just going to speak bluntly, okay? The word on the street and within our community is, while Walter Williams was researching that book, it was common knowledge that he would stoop young Native boys, younger Native boys. If you do Google his name right now, I think that he is in disgrace of some sort of stooping young guys in some Asian country like Thailand or some Asian country. So his scholarship, his academic reputation has been mired within that. And I knew that when I was talking about his work is that it was common knowledge that he was having sex with our young Two-Spirit people while he would go to gatherings and research on this book. So I hesitantly don't really use his name or invoke his name because of that history. And that was an internal dialogue, but now because of what happened in the Asian country, it is much more public, and his reputation has been mired around that. But I will say that back in 1995, 96, when I got a copy of that book, it sent me on this trajectory that I sit here today. And so I must give homage and I must honor that work. What I really deeply appreciated around Walter Williams's book, it gave me a framework to begin my inquiry that has led me here today. I also deeply appreciate the almost 130 some pages of footnotes in the historical archive that is just rich. And I love just combing through the book and looking at its archive, the footnotes, because it is so beautiful and gives me ways in which that I can go back but at the same time I can challenge some of the things because I'm given the primary access to the primary documents to make my own assessments. I think I should go back and reread that because it's been years since I reread it. And I may have a different take on it now that I've been doing this work for about 20 years. And I'm not an archaeologist, and so I cannot answer the question around the physical archival work. I don't really know how to even begin that conversation.
Well, I think we could have a follow-up conversation about that, because I think you and other Two-Spirits would be very interested in perhaps exploring the potential antiquity of third and fourth and other genders in the archaeological record, but some of the insights that you may be able to provide us. So I look forward to a future conversation with you. Thank you.
That would be so nice, George.
Ross, you're muted.
And I'm not in the conversation. Julia had a question, so I brought her in.
Hi. First off, Harlan, I just want to say that was an amazing talk. It was so wonderful because I've been familiar with some of the concepts, and I've seen people who identify as Two-Spirit or have fallen into that category, and it's been great to just kind of get more detail and to really kind of get someone to explain what the nuances of that and why it doesn't necessarily fit into a lot of the the things that we've come to identify within kind of Western queer understandings of self and stuff. So my question for you then is, you talked a lot about kind of the historical roles socially and culturally that Two-Spirit people would have within a lot of, you know, diverse Indigenous cultures. What do you see going forward as the role of the Two-Spirit individual kind of in the present and in the future of not just Indigenous society, but in larger social context as well?
Sure. I think that and I'm going to speak deeply personally, because I know that a lot of my work, and I like, unbeknownst to me, is that I just naturally fall into these tween spaces, right? Not a teeny, that tween space, right? Mm-hmm. Like the mere act of me being here today, and as a community member, and bridging that link between the academy and your language, and I can talk on, like, we can go toe to toe. We can talk at some ontological underpinnings in which I presented an ontological challenge to Western conceptions of being. We can talk methodologically. We can talk epistemologically. And what I can do is bridge the two spaces, both from an Indigenous perspective and this academy and your own ontological understanding. So I naturally step into that translational space, and I comfortably dwell between the two worlds. I comfortably dwell between my men's community and my women's community, the work that I do within my program here at the BCCDC. I also dwell between our races within the white queer spaces, where racism is well and alive, and my Native communities, and bridge and facilitate conversations. And so I'm always like stepping in these tween spaces, and I just naturally, and I speak both languages or all multiple languages of those spaces, and can translate between the two. And it's something in which that I don't know why, but I just comfortably dwell in those tween places, and I never ever get flustered because I'm always providing that translational space. Now, at the same time, and I didn't bring it up in my presentation today, I do want to go back to, because I want to go to your point of hearing about like some gender diversity conversations within the broader Western queer movement. That it drives me wild. If you want to talk about a site of colonization, we must look at queer theory, queer organizing, and queer communities. It drives me wild, in which here is this community, primarily of non-Indigenous white people, that head up most of the gay organizations. And if they want diversity, they throw on a white woman. That's diversity, right? But it is this movement of like, they're fighting for equality, or fighting for equality. And my pause has always been, equal to what? So if we're fighting to be equal like white men, white heterosexual cisgendered men, that's not an equality that I want. But two is that there was a time, and a lot of that queer organizing is there's a presumption of innocence, meaning that they are quite happy to say that they are in for the good fight, and they are in for the good fight. However, they never cop to the reality, or they never go back and say, on this land, there was a time in which that people were engaged in same-sex sexual relations, had full equality, full citizenship, and full participations within their societies. Is there something that we can learn from that? And for them to humble themselves to say, we can learn from our Indigenous relatives, our Two-Spirit relatives, but they never begin that conversation there. Where they begin is, this is my notion of equality, and we will fight for this. And then when they attain it, like same-sex marriages, same-sex civil marriages, they pat themselves on their back righteously and say, look, we have won this right, not understanding that I had the right to marry prior to them, and that was taken away by their people. That is the presumption of innocence. And that's what drives me wild, and it drives me wacky and keeps me up at night. That they have never humbled themselves.
Yeah.
And on whose land are they on? And so I think what we have to do is to create those spaces for those intercultural dialoguing, that respect, that honor, and maybe even one day love, or what you may call reconciliation. But really, it hurts my eye teeth and my teeth to see them just live this presumption of innocence, and they're not innocent. Goodness.
Well, I appreciate that. That's and yeah, that falls within a lot of my own kind of personal experiences, because I have family members who fall into that kind of membership of the queer community where it's very white, it's very, you know, Western, and that seems to be the type of activism that gets taken place. So I'm very excited to kind of share your work and hopefully influence them in ways.
Thank you. Any other questions? And I won't get on a soapbox, okay?
Ross, you're muted again.
This is a newbie mistake. Leah wrote in the question and answers, "Thank you so much for your talk. It was very informative and engaging. Many of us aren't being graded on attending." My question is, do you find in the Indigenous communities you've spoken to / worked with that there's still a lot of knowledge, awareness about two-spirit identities, or has some of that knowledge been lost?
Definitely some of it has been lost. However, so I get, this is going to be such a hard, it's a hard, complicated, but just bear with me, okay? Our greatest teacher is our great mother. Y'all would call that Earth. We call it our great mother, right? And because she is our teacher, is that we've, you know, I think that we're being schooled and we have like learned, like there has been this renaissance in which that people are going back to our ceremonies, going back to the sacredness, and that we're reconnecting with our greatest teacher. Thereby, we will have access to all of those teachings again. Now, we'll have access to the songs, we'll have access to the stories, but the stories are going to be different. You know, the beat of the drum, the song, you know, traditionally, or the one that lost may be this fast, right? Where today, song might be this fast. But because it's coming from the same teacher, the teaching will be the same. The form will be different. And I think try as they might, they almost succeeded in cutting us from our great teacher, cutting us from our land. That I think that why we as Native people always like, it's always about land, is because we want to maintain that connection to our greatest teacher, our mother. And so I know that I could mourn and I could like say the loss of like so many of these teachings, some of the words, some of our ceremonies, but I firmly do not mourn that. It is once we connect and we go back and we make our connection to our greatest teachers, we still have access to the exact same teaching and the same knowledge. So there is no mourning, there is an opportunity. What little information we do have, we should hang on to, but at the same time, because we're living, breathing cultures, we must change and we must conform with today. And so for me is, I always look back at the traditional teachings, but with a contemporary understanding and what is that relevancy to breathe life into it, because we live here today. So that's why, you know, when I began my PhD program, I remember sitting with this elder, and she's an associate, a tenured professor. And I was like, do you have any like advice for me? And she's like, yes. You know, and I offered her a little tobacco. And she said, and I was thinking, you know, she was like, study hard, read this book, do that. She took my tobacco and she was like, fast and go to ceremony. And that was her teaching. She was within that fasting, in that ceremony, she was like saying, who are you? And what is your relationship to our greatest teacher? And never forget that. And so that is my teaching of like, yes, we can mourn all the loss of the ceremonies, but it's not gone for us. And so each year I can make it back to my territory. Not this year, but I do a 4-day water and food fast. No food, no water for 4 days. And let me tell you, it is magical.
Thanks, Harlan. I got this now. I'm going to ask one sort of obvious or perhaps appropriate to the context. What do you see the role of post-secondary education in this fight, if you want, in this learning, in this change to how we view Two-Spirit people?
Well, I think it's like creating spaces like this today that challenges Western notions and concepts, right? Because I'm sure that the way in which that we're like, even that whole thing around sex and sexuality. And it's also opening up a space, you know, and I conformed to your spaces of like having all of my citations and my references and having the footnotes of where I got the information from. I'm playing your game. I could have just started off with some stories of Whiskey Jack and our trickster and some of the gender and Two-Spirit teachings of our stories. But you would have not had a context to know those teachings. So I think but when you do, I think within the academy is to really, first of all, to not say that that your notions of knowledge, rationality, that there are other equally important notions, like my 4-day water and food fast, that it's irrational, but let me tell you, it is, I would say it's even more powerful than your systems of knowledge and how you gain knowledge and how you gain wisdom. We must lift and hold up and not, I don't want to say that we don't need your affirmation. We just need your mindfulness and your respectfulness. As I was being respectful in footnoting and doing the citations, and I'm being respectful to your all, like that respect has to be mirrored back. So when you meet an elder and you ask them a question and they start rambling on and you're like, what the heck are you talking about? Patience. They're teaching you, and they're teaching them within their own epistemological way. We don't have to conform to you. Sometimes you have to bend to us, epistemologically and also ontologically. And you just have to be mindful and respectful, as I have been mindful and respectful to you all. And I see Westerners, when we get into a room of elders and our elders start talking, I know exactly what's going on. And my poor non-Indigenous people are just like, what? And then what's worse is that we often bend and we make it easy for you as colonizers to engage with us.
But the opposite is not necessarily true.
Oh my God, when I stepped into a PhD program, no one was there to wipe my nose. Every space that I go into in the white world is I'm always there on my own trying to figure it out. Your language, your ways, your protocols. I kind of liken it to if I took this entire class and went to a Sundance. And I didn't tell you any coding, any protocols, any language. And I said, have at it, figure it out. One, we would never do that to you, because we know what it feels like. We would be there at your side telling you, here, do this, here, stand here, here. This is what's going on. And we would decode it and show you all of the protocols so that you felt a part of the process. Native people, we rarely get that. We must accept your knowledge. We must accept your ways of gathering knowledge and what is truth on your terms. That you never, ever, ever, rarely is that ever, that you ever have to face that when you're engaging with us as Native people. Quite the contrary. And I'm also, another little theory, if someone wants to join me on it, is I'm looking for a word or a concept that when the oppressor or the colonizer, when they look to the oppressed to do their work, meaning like if I were to take you to a Sundance and just say, have at it, right? More than likely you would turn to me and say, what's going on here? And I would then teach you and I would do your work for you. Where when I step into the academy, I have to figure that out on my own. And so, or like when the oppressed is asked to do a cultural safety training. Like we're constantly being like, not only are we oppressed, but then we're asked to do your own anti-oppression work. That's your work.
Which is rampant in the academy now in terms of the few Indigenous, First Nations, queer people who are in the academy end up doing huge amounts of labor towards that.
Right. And so I think that we have to be a little bit more mindful and we have to be a little bit more respectful, but we also have to model each other's, like, and I'm not slagging you. I think that you all, like, your intent is good, you have good hearts. But we just must pause, reflect, and to get into more mindful and better relations with one another. And literally, yes, so that at one point there can be love. And there's that honoring of that sacred space that dwells between and within all of us. We must always be incredibly conscious of that sacred space. And that's what freaks the academy out. It freaks healthcare industry out. We have this, like, within healthcare, it's like trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care is how to teach healthcare professionals how to talk about and how to invoke love without talking about love or invoking love. That's what trauma-informed care means, or patient-centric care, that you actually give a dang of that person in front of you. So it freaks the academy out when you start talking a language of love, of sacredness, of honoring. No, we have to move to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think creating spaces that we can have frank, honest conversations like this in dialogue that may be uncomfortable for you all, but the other way of not doing that means that it's uncomfortable for me and other people like me. We must be uncomfortable with each other mutually, but we also must be supportive of each other's uncomfortability.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think we should probably end here. I don't see any further hands up. I wanted to thank you, and I wanted to read a couple of, I won't read them all, but, you know, we've got all kinds of comments here of thank you, Harlan, for an amazing talk. Tracy in particular said, brilliant, beautiful, and affirming talk. Thank you so much for your work. And I think that really sums it up for me anyway. So yeah, I'm so glad we had this opportunity and that you put a lot of labor into this at a time when we all wish we were just staring at the election results in Pennsylvania or something, and you've taken time out of your day for us.
Thank God. I'm so looking forward to having a Biden administration. After being fired by Trump, I constantly get asked to partake as a consultant or to be grant reviewers for federal and NIH listening sessions and stuff like that. And I don't want to have any association with 45. And so I've just been saying no, no, no. So I'm waiting to engage back in the administration and the important work that's happening within the United States. So.
Yeah, yeah.
Ugh. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Harlan. I'm going to stop the
Thank
recording
you.
at this point, folks.